Hello,
Hello,
Dr. Niboh.
how are you?
I'm great. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yeah, Niboh is fine.
Niboh.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, I'm Kathryn. It's nice to meet you.
nice to meet you too. I'm sorry, I don't know how I got this other invitation Google to Google Chat. That's where I went.
Oh, no, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah. I don't know how that happened, but I did receive an invitation to go to Google Chat. So I went there and I was waiting,
Oh, no,
and then it was past 2, and I thought.
I'm
So
sorry.
well, I'm not sure. It may not be your fault. I
No, I
think
think
it's,
it is.
it,
I'm
uh,
good with this. I was trying to put it on my calendar to see if I could get an alert, and
uh-huh.
so it must have alerted you too, but I didn't realize it would take you to Google Chat. I only do them on Zoom, so that was totally my fault. I was
Oh,
experimenting.
okay.
I'm so sorry.
So
Oh,
I was sitting there by myself for the last 5 minutes thinking. Then I was actually getting my phone to call you.
uh-huh.
And then when I picked up my phone, I realized, oh, there's a message from you on Messenger. And then I realized that you've been waiting for me on on Zoom.
Oh, well, I'm sorry for the confusion. I know better now not to do that in the future. But thanks for your patience and thanks for
Well,
talking to me.
you seem to have a facility with this technology that I don't yet have. So I think that's one thing I'm going to learn from you. How you how you've set up yourself to be able to make this happen. I don't even know what you know. So if you think you know little, just know I don't even know what you know.
Oh goodness. Well, I could teach you what I know for sure. It's
That
minimal, but
that will be wonderful.
I'm learning more every day.
Yes.
And doing these interviews, I've only been doing them for the past couple of months, so I'm learning as I go. And they do these
Yes.
updates on Zoom, and then things change. So whatever, we just got to roll with the punches, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I just want to tell you just right off the bat that when I was conducting some research on you, I am just so touched and intrigued and inspired by what you're doing in your home country. And I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Is it Cameroon?
Yes.
Cameroon, Africa.
Hmm.
Um, I am an entrepreneur myself. And, the fact that you are helping people to create sustainable income with enterprise and then also giving back um, with humanitarian projects, helping them with seed money to get that accomplished and all the mentorship that your organization does. And the organization's called the Torchbearer, right? Or is it, I saw Ignite Africa too. Both.
Both.
Yeah. Just super inspiring and honestly, just reading your history about where you came from and the poverty that you endured. In fact, reading about your mother, Helen, and the fact that you were 17 years old and wanting to get into this mechanics program that cost a few $100s. Um, and it took a year for you to save $100 because your mother was making $2 a week. And
And that was the dream.
oh, I mean, oh my goodness, it literally brought me to tears. I just couldn't even fathom that.
Needless to say, we did exceed that dream, but that was actually a dream at the time.
Well, you got to start somewhere,
We
right?
were thinking if we could do that, we'll be all right.
I mean, wow. And then your journey to America and, getting your PhD in, is it nuclear physics?
Yes.
Yeah, becoming a professor and just all the diversified life experience that you have. Just quite amazing. So I'm just really honored to talk to you and to know you. So thanks for taking some time out to talk to me.
Well, thank you. I'm happy you didn't find out all the stuff about stalking and serial killing and all of that other stuff. So
Oh, Lord.
that means I'm doing a good job at hiding all the other stuff.
Only the good stuff out there.
Yeah, all of the good stuff is out there.
Oh, well, this is great. And obviously, you and I have messaged a little bit about what the purpose of this interview is. And so deconstruction, obviously I'm talking about Christianity. I know you're a man of faith. Um, and I want to get into, kind of what your spiritual background is and everything, but just to kind of
Mhm.
give you a little bit of history with me, I was raised Catholic. I became a born again Christian in my early 20s, and kind of, I grew, but I kind of was like this level person in Christianity for a long time. And then the past year and a half, um, I went through massive deconstruction of some really, really core beliefs that I had, wrapped around Jesus and God, and even myself. And it was a pretty painful process for me, but also very exciting too, and hopeful. Recently came out of that, and not to say that I'm still not unraveling certain things and learning and growing, but I've started the process of kind of reconstructing my belief systems, and I've really become fascinated with the whole process of deconstruction and people's journeys with it, and what they experience, and why they get into it in the first place, and what
Yeah.
beliefs they had and now what beliefs they have now.
Hmm.
um, and so I just started talking to people and wanting to hear their stories, and connecting people too, because I think a lot of us have felt alone during the journey at times.
Hmm. Hmm.
Just that isolation, and sometimes fear, sometimes anxiety, those things can creep in. It's not everybody's experience, of course, but um, so, just in telling you a little bit about that background, can you share with me what your spiritual background is?
Yeah, I would agree with you, especially about the loneliness part. In fact, uh, thinking about this conversation with you, I was almost as excited as if I was going on a date.
That's awesome.
Because I have actually been going through stuff now for the past 15 years. Um, for me, I was, I was raised in the church. I have, I have basically been a Christian, the best I know of Christianity in my whole life. The thing where people say, well, uh, like Christian testimonies where people say, well, I was first a jerk, and then I was a drunkard, and I was sleeping with every person that I could meet. And then one day I saw Christ, and then I left all of that stuff. I don't have that kind of a testimony because for all of my life, I have been in the church. I have been friendly to the church. In fact, I have been a church leader for for most of my adult life. I've never been a pastor because I'm not ordained for that role, but I have played the role of a deacon from the time from I was in my early 20s to now.
Wow.
I have only stopped playing that role actually in the last 8 years, and so generally I've been friendly to Christianity. But in terms of my spiritual journey, uh, I was my mother Helen that you read about always took me to church as a kid, and I was this kid that was for the most part a good kid. I never wanted to get into fights. I never wanted to get into trouble, and I was also blessed to be a reasonably good student.
Mhm.
So my parents, mostly my mom, she loved me, and my teachers talked well about me. So my sense of God was that, well, God must feel really good about me because as a child, my understanding of God was basically an extended heavenly parent. So that was my earliest recollection of having any kind of spiritual interactions. I was quickly awakened from that dream by learning that the best of us are like filthy rags in the eyes of God. So I thought, wow, I thought I was doing pretty good. How come this Bible is telling me that I am at best like filthy rags in the eyes of God? So that bothered me some. But then the church said, yeah, you may be like filthy rags in the eyes of God, but hey, he's gracious and he still loves you. He tolerates you.
Tolerate.
So I bought into that aspect of, I said, okay, great. I mean, he is an almighty God. If he tolerates me despite my filth, I'm fine with that, especially if it means that I'm not going to go to hell after I die. Because you see, up to that time, my understanding of God was this guy in heaven whom we have to please so that he can take us into his heaven. No, but even as a kid, that bothered me. Because in the village, even my parents, we came from the poorest of the poor. So even in the poor village in which I was growing up, we were the poorest. We didn't have a house to live in. And if you don't have a house to live in the village, that's bad. So when I went to church and I would hear sermons about God who loves us so much that he's building mansions for us in heaven, the thought always came to my mind, gee, I wish he would just build at least a house for us here.
Right.
So that we can live
in right now.
Yeah. And then when I heard about God paving streets of heaven with gold, I was thinking, there's no paved road in my village. If God could just at least plow a road to my village, and not even pave it, that would be wonderful. So even as a kid, I was beginning to struggle. But when you are a fairly compliant kid and you love your mother and you don't want to make any trouble, you quickly put that on a shelf and then you go play outside and do your chores and be a good kid again.
Right.
Now, when I actively started to study the Bible, I started to find so many things, some of which were wonderful. I read the stories which were inspiring, but then I would come across something that just didn't sit right with me. For one, much of the culture of the people in the Bible was very easy for me to understand because the scenarios seemed very much like the village in which I was growing up. Wow. But then when I went to church, I got a clear sense that the church wanted us to do something different. And so when you become a teenager and you are a fairly inquisitive one, and you start to ask questions, it doesn't take long for you to get into trouble. I'll just mention two things, and I won't go into detail. First, it was the drinking of alcohol.
Good one.
My church didn't drink, but my village drank. And I could see that many of the pastors that were teaching that we shouldn't drink on Sundays were drinking on Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays.
Wow.
And so it started to bother me. And so when I raised this issue with a youth pastor, rather than him dealing with me on the issue, he accused me of looking for an excuse to drink. And that's funny because to this day, I still don't drink.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
And then the second one had to do with sex and relationships. In Africa, like in the Bible, there was polygamy. And so the church was constantly preaching about that. And to make matters worse, there were polygamists in the village who wanted to be part of the church. And the church wouldn't let them be part of the church. And so my friends' parents were polygamists, so their wives would go to church, but the guy wouldn't go to church because he was not accepted.
Wow.
So I couldn't make sense of that. But again, when you are a peace lover, like I say, I'm a lover, not a fighter.
You want to keep the peace.
I keep the peace. And here is the way I kept the peace. I thought to myself, okay, and actually this is what I was taught. The idea was, well, you are not very mature now. When your relationship with God grows and you better understand these things, then you will make sense of it. Well, fast forward until 15 years ago, I realized it wasn't making any sense. But more importantly, I started to see what was going on in the world, and I started to dig into scripture more and more, and I came to realize I was right. What I knew intuitively, what I knew instinctively was correct. So 15 years ago, I started to consciously rethink everything.
Wow.
And as I started to rethink everything, I found out I didn't fit anywhere. Not even in the church in which I was a leader.
Okay.
And so up to that time, I was already quite lonely because I would think about these things from time to time and put them in the shelf and go ahead and do what I needed to do to raise a family and feed the kids and survive in society. But there came a time when I started to realize I really needed to rethink my relationship with God. And I would say this is probably where my own deconstruction started actively, because I had been postponing it up to this time. And I started with the issue of sin. I had to ask myself, what really is sin? In Matthew 6:36, Christ says, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So what is this righteousness?
Mm.
And I thought about that for a long time. And then of course, I am curious, so I read what other people had to say about it. I found some other authors. I found this pastor that had been kicked out of his church because after counseling with couples for 30 years, he decided that what the church was teaching about marriage and other things, sexual, was wrong. Was wrong. It was counter to human nature, but more importantly, it wasn't even biblical.
Wow.
But when he started to talk about it, he actually wrote a book about it. Of course, he got kicked out because if you teach anything other than what the orthodoxy is in many churches, you don't survive. So I learned a few things from him, which really gave me peace. But I still had to answer the question to myself, what really is sin? I finally went back to scripture and dug deeper. And I resolved one thing that perplexed me about scripture for many years, especially as a young person, especially in the Old Testament, where God's people were to go into these lands and they were to destroy everything. Remember, I'm a lover, I'm not a fighter.
Right.
So when I read stories of people being killed, it bothers me. Mm-hmm. Up till now, if I have to choose between watching an explicitly sexual movie and watching an explicitly violent movie, I would rather watch the explicitly sexual movie than watch an explicitly violent movie. My system doesn't handle violence that well. So that bothered me even when I was a teen. And then there's actually one of those stories where this guy has sacrificed himself in battle and it's coming back home and happened to pick up a few things to take for himself. And somehow God is so upset, God strikes him dead. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, God, what kind of a God are you? This guy has sacrificed almost, he could have been killed in battle. And then now you get upset at him for picking up a few treasures.
Right, and strike him dead.
Yeah, and so those things bothered me. But later on, I came to realize that one, the reason those things bothered me is because of the legalism in which I had been raised. I had a legalistic understanding of sin and righteousness. And that legalism is founded on an unstated assumption about the nature of things. And it is that actions have intrinsic meaning. And I started to ask myself, do actions really have intrinsic meaning? It didn't take long for me to find out, no, actions don't have intrinsic meaning. Actions are just things. They're just neutral. We give meaning to them.
Interesting. Okay.
I could give you a kiss, and that kiss could be a kiss of love, and that kiss could be a kiss of betrayal. And both kisses would look identical. So what that kiss really means is not to be found out by dissecting the kiss. What that kiss really means is to be found by looking at the heart of the person who is doing the kissing.
Okay.
Then I understood almost for the first time why both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, there is so much emphasis on the heart. And then I understood almost for the first time. It was almost like for that moment, I became God. I could then see why actions that looked good to me from God's perspective, they were not good because God could see the heart of the person that was doing it. Mm-hmm. And God could see that although this person is doing a wonderful thing, his motives for doing it are not that wonderful. And that is why the Old Testament in particular, and even some aspects of the New Testament, looked contradictory to me, you see. Because I was looking at the externals, I was looking at the actions and saying, oh, this person is doing such a good thing. Why is God not happy with him? You see. And then I started to realize, Kathryn, that this particular message, God has been teaching us from Genesis to Revelations.
About looking at the heart?
Yes, this particular thing about looking at the heart is plastered throughout Scripture. And yet legalism compels us to judge just based on the actions. Yes, and if you are judging just based on the action and somebody's doing something good, you think his heart is good. But his heart may not be good even when he's doing something good. And of course, vice versa. In fact, that was when, and this is funny, because as a youth leader, I preached so many sermons on 1 Corinthians 13. We used to call it the love chapter. Mm-hmm. And I heard so many sermons from that same chapter. But very few of those sermons ever dealt seriously with the first 3 verses. Most of the sermons started with verse 4 that says love is patient. And then goes down to verse 13 that says that the greatest 3 are hope, faith, and love. Mm-hmm. I don't remember hearing too many sermons on the first 3 verses where Paul says some really radical things. And because in those 3 verses, Paul is saying that you could speak in the language of angels, but if you have no love in your heart, you are nothing but a clanging bell and a noisy whatever Paul says. He says you could actually give yourself up to be burnt as a sacrifice. But if you have no love, it doesn't benefit you anything. Mm-hmm. For the first time, the first 3 verses of 1 Corinthians 13 became more important to me than the next 10 verses of that chapter. And then I started to realize the Spirit of the Lord had really been on me from the time I was a little kid in the village and causing me to respond more to love than to law.
Amen.
And yet, the church was convincing me of the exact opposite. And of course, there are many other implications that have grown out of this basic understanding. And that is why in the last few years, I have not been describing myself very much as a Christian. I've been describing myself as a lover of Christ. Or when it is convenient, I describe myself as a follower of Christ. But I prefer actually a lover of Christ, because I have actually fallen in love with Christ in much the same way as I fell in love with my wife. So I was explaining this to my team in Rwanda earlier this year. And I said, what does that mean? How can you say that? And I said, forget about the romantic part for a moment and think about what's the first thing that happens when you fall in love with somebody. Well, people were quiet for a second. I said, no, tell me, what is the first thing you do? No, don't talk about kissing that person or holding that person's hand, because that doesn't apply in this case. Christ is not here in person for me to kiss him or hold his hand. But what happens? And the room was quiet for a second. And at the end of that conversation, we had all agreed that one of the things you begin to do is that before you do something, you just naturally think to yourself, what would this person think about what I'm doing? That to me is the first sign that you are in love, because that person now matters to you. Usually that person hasn't even told you what they like or what they don't like, right? But because you love that person, you are already beginning to think about what that person would like. You see, I said that is the same thing when I say I'm in love with Christ. It means that when I am doing what I'm doing, I am thinking to myself, what would Jesus do? What would he have me do? And that then enables me to relate to God from a place of love and no longer from a fear that if I die, I will go to hell. In fact, in the church in which I currently attend, we were having a Bible study one day. And I told the gentleman with whom I was having the Bible study, I'm not sure how we got to the issue of hell. And I just blotted it out. I said, I would still love Jesus Christ even if I knew for sure that hell didn't exist. And he stopped for a second and he thought, he says, how is that? I said, because I'm in love with the guy. My relationship with him is not based on fear.
Right, fear of the afterlife.
Yeah.
Going. Mm-hmm.
So that is how my own deconstruction journey has happened. So I have gone from legalism to love. I have gone from a fear-based relationship with God to a loving relationship with God. And yes, and the funny thing, Kathryn, is that I went there by actually questioning. You see, I was uncomfortable with the Bible, and so I dug deeper into it to try to understand it. Mm-hmm. And I am more, if I could use that word about a book, it's a stretch, but let me just say I'm more comfortable with the Bible now than I was growing up. Because to me, growing up, it was just a list of things to do. Some of them sounded impossible. Some of them were actually contradictory. And so while some of the stories were inspiring, I had a huge love-hate relationship with the book. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I have come to see that even the passages of scripture that made me uncomfortable, if you took a before and after picture where that passage is in the middle, you would see that even though that passage was made me uncomfortable, it was an improvement on what existed. For example, let's take the Apostle Paul. I'm a feminist, and my definition of a feminist is that I want my daughter to have the same opportunities in life as my sons.
Yes.
And so there's a sense in which Paul comes across as not very nice to women. Mm-hmm. And yes, Paul does say some things that the church has used in ways that are not helpful to women. But when you take a look at the culture in which Paul is saying those things, you realize that even what looks from today's vantage point as insensitive to women or as chauvinistic is actually an improvement on the culture in which those things were said. And so I have fallen in love with the Bible from Genesis to Revelations, not because everything in the Bible is perfect, but because I have this larger context for which, in which to place that story. Mm-hmm. And it makes me to see that if Paul were writing to this culture, he would say things differently than he said then, because his heart was that the women be treated well.
And I mean, you realize that that is a radical statement. I mean, I agree with you, but that's a radical statement to mainstream Christians.
Yes, and hence my loneliness.
Yes, and I want to talk about that a little bit more because, I think, as I said, most people do experience a similar feeling when they're starting to question things. And as you brought up, in your own experience from an early age, you got in trouble, when you started asking questions that were challenging. And you
got in trouble with my youth pastor.
I mean, calling out some hypocrisy, right? I mean, and some things that were troubling you, and you were met with resistance. You were met with unpleasantries. And then as an adult, you mentioned also when you started to really, face some of these challenging concepts in your spirituality. You mentioned how if you go against the orthodoxy in mainstream church, you won't survive. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the church that you were a part of when you started this journey, did you attempt at that time to have discussions with people that you were close with in the church or leadership, and you were shut down, or did you just not even try?
At this point in time, 15 years ago, I was still I didn't tell you about this part of my deconstruction because it's a complex story. Even though it's relatively simple.
I understand.
Part of it So what I'm about to say is there's a yes and no. Did I explicitly come right out and share some of these things? No, I didn't share these things with anybody. Because remember, my understanding of sexual morality changed. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, you know that you are living, you have at any time. My theology also changed. I mean, if I were to mention in church that I don't really know if there is a physical location in the universe with a zip code called hell,
right?
My ordination as a deacon in the Southern Baptist Church would immediately be revoked. Wow. So I didn't raise these issues, but there were other issues that came up. And this had to do with my background as a scientist. In order to do this work in Africa, I had left the practice of nuclear physics research, and I took up the professorship at the university to teach mathematics and physics. And then I did move to this small Christian college, and I was teaching there, and which meant I had to teach things related to the Big Bang theory and the theory of evolution. So those things immediately got me into trouble with my pastor. And although we never really fought, the tension was healthy.
Okay.
And although the tension between me and the pastor was healthy, because he was trying to convert me and I was trying to convert him.
Wow.
He was a young earth, he still is a young earth creationist, and I'm not. Mm-hmm. And he believes all this other funny stuff that I don't believe, that are not scientific. And so he and we would dialogue on some of those things. And so our conversations, even though we never really changed in each other's minds, because he just saw me as one of those wayward liberal professors at the university, there were some students in my class that sort of reported me to their parents. And so let me set up the scenario for you. So here am I, a professor at the Christian university, teaching the curriculum that I was given to teach at that Christian university. And then I am also a deacon at this Southern Baptist church. And then I have started a missionary organization. And I'm regularly taking students from both the church and the college on mission trips.
Wow.
So that's my background right there.
Okay.
So this girl who knows me in church, her grandmother is the chairperson of my foundation. She comes, sits in my science class, and because I teach that the theory of evolution is scientific, she goes and tells her family that Dr. Niboh is not a Christian. Think about that.
Wow. That must have been tough.
So I'm in this church. I'm one of the ordained deacons in the church. And before I was ordained, I went through an inquisition. That's what the Southern Baptists do, right? The rest of the deacons will sit you down, and then everybody will ask you any questions that they want to ask you. So the chairperson of my board of directors calls me someday and says, Martin, you got to stop teaching this. You got to stop saying things in your class that's causing young people to lose their faith. So I asked her the following question. I said, tell me, where in scripture did Christ say that he shall know that we are his followers by which scientific theories we believe or don't believe? Well, I hope I could tell you that that ended the matter. But I was able, remember, I'm a lover, not a fighter. Mm-hmm. So I always would try to find ways to make peace. But I have found out, as somebody said, not everybody can love me because I'm not pizza.
Everybody loves pizza.
Everybody loves pizza. So, so that is where my public confrontations started. It started with scientific matters. And so I went public on those issues. And then, of course, I went public on theological matters. Well, needless to say that this church that I helped to build and who were very excited about the work that my foundation is doing in Africa, and we're providing financial support. When I went political, and when I say I went political, it's not that I actually went political, because up to that time, I considered myself a Republican. You see, and so I voted for the George W. Bush. And of course, I despised the Clintons for the same reasons almost every Republican despised them. And then when Trump came along, first, Trump's track record from the 70s with him being sued for discriminating against Blacks in their housing. And then in the 80s and 90s with him insisting that the Central Park Five were guilty and should be put to death, and continue to hold that position even after the police had indicated that the five young men were not guilty of the crime. And then in the 2000s, him becoming a birther and claiming that Barack Obama wasn't born in this country. So when he started to run for office, I had no place for him. And so when I started to post on Facebook against Trump, uh, I got into trouble with both the Christian school in which I was teaching and the church in which I was deacon.
Wow.
And so the church promptly took away their financial contribution to our work and asked me to submit a statement, to reapply and to submit a statement of faith. I didn't do it physically, but in my mind, I gave them the middle finger. And so I never did. Of course, the school had gotten upset with me. Oh, because leading up to that, Vice President Cheney, that I voted for, had been making statements about torture that I disagreed with. And so I had written against that too. I said, no, there's no reason why we should speak cavalierly about torture. And interestingly, one person that agreed with me was George W. Bush himself.
Wow.
But the Christian college that only brings in conservative speakers felt that speaking against Dick Cheney had gone too far. And so my relationship with that school is basically inexistent, very much as my relationship with that church is also inexistent. So I do have some scars to show for my deconstruction.
I'm so sorry that that happened to you. I mean, that is that's a lot. That's a lot. I mean, why do you think Christians can be so rigid about you know, some of the spiritual stuff that we teach, or you know, that you were teaching? I mean, these are big, they're big deals, you know, in the Christian faith, and I get that, but what do you think is behind that fear, just systemically in the institutional church? You know,
That's a big, that's a big
political. It's a big question. I know. You know,
that's a big question, and at the heart of all fear is vulnerability. It's a lack of humility. You see, we haven't developed the mind of Christ. And Philippians chapter 2 tells us that the mind of Christ is humility. You see, he was God, but didn't consider himself that, but emptied himself and humbled himself. You see, that's what Paul understands as the mind of Christ, is the humble mind. Mm-hmm. Of course, the heart of Christ is the heart of love.
Right.
You see, so we carry these labels of saying we are Christians, but it is just because we have accepted some basic prepositions, like saying, okay, how do we become Christians? By admitting that we believe Christ is the Son of God. Mm-hmm. That's it. For most, and then of course, depending on which church you go to, then they hand you a set of rules to follow.
That's right. Yeah.
And then when you begin to follow those rules, then you are considered a Christian. Mm-hmm. And there is really not much transformation. And so becoming religious or becoming a Christian actually becomes a glorification of the ego.
Wow.
And therefore, when you build up that edifice to worship the ego, you feel very threatened when somebody questions it.
That makes total sense.
So that is a simplistic explanation of it, because like with everything involved with human nature, it's a whole lot more complex. But I think that's at the heart of it.
So do you see, in your experience, do you see deconstruction being a movement that's happening right now? I know there's been prior deconstructions before, but do you see it as a movement right now? Do you see this changing in the institutional church?
Well, I think what has happened actually is technology. And for example, you and I, we have not met. I don't even know what city you are in. What part of the world are you in, Kathryn?
Lewis, Delaware.
Okay.
Yes.
So here you are in Delaware. Here we are talking, and I just now this thought to find out where you are. So this technology has enabled us to find each other. And I think it has also a way of exposing us to what other people believe. And that creates its own dynamic. But, and so there may be a sense in which deconstruction is happening more now, because we can more easily find those who are part of our tribes.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
But I think there's a sense in which deconstruction is almost always going on, even if it is not in big ways. Yeah, sometimes we dig up the whole foundation like you probably did a year ago and examine it. And there are other times in which we are just examining the windows, or maybe we're examining the kitchen, or we're examining the bedroom.
Right.
And so I subscribe more to what Father Richard Rohr describes as order, disorder, and reorder.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read Richard Rohr?
I have. I'm actually almost done with the Universal Christ.
Okay, right. So you know what I'm talking about. So yes. So I think that happens with any normal thinking person. Now, sometimes the issue is peripheral and it doesn't raise any ripples. And so we go through the phase of disorder and reorder, and nobody notices us. And sometimes we don't even think it's a big deal. Oh, I just changed my mind about this particular thing, and then life just goes on.
Right.
And then sometimes it's a huge foundational thing that just uproots everything you ever built, scatters it everywhere, and you have to start building again. Now, this second one is the one that we usually notice and document. Right. Yes, and write books on, like Glennon Doyle. I guess you know her.
I'm not sure I do, actually.
Okay, she is this Christian blogger that apparently she was. I never knew her, but my world can be small sometimes. But apparently she's very popular, or she was very popular in Christian circles.
Okay.
Of course, she was married to the love of her life. And, and interestingly, she was writing about marriage. And you know, if you're in Christian circles and you're writing about family and monogamy and how everything works perfectly well, uh, everybody loves you.
Mm-hmm.
But but she was experiencing something else internally, and that thing exploded on her a few years ago when she was at the church giving a presentation, and this woman was sitting on the front row. And immediately she saw that woman, she knew that that's who she'd been looking for her whole life. And then as she came to find out, that woman was Wamba, the captain of the American soccer team for many years. And of course, they fell in love. And so she left her husband, and she is now married to this other woman. In her book, Untamed, which I haven't read, but which others have read and told me about, I think she tells this story. So despite those years where she was extolling the virtues of heterosexuality, she was struggling with her own sexuality. And nobody knew except her. Mm-hmm. And of course, it came a time when she confided in her husband that she wasn't happy, even in this perfect marriage that they were together. And then I started to explain to her that it wasn't his fault and all of that. Anyway, so when you have those types of momentous changes, yeah. Yeah. Where you totally rip the whole foundations, and then you are in this total disorder, and then you start to rearrange things again, then it becomes something of which movies can be made.
Yeah.
And that is what we tend to call deconstruction and things like that. But I think that we have minor deconstructions going on other issues from time to time. At least I think that if you are actually living a conscious life at any level, mm-hmm. As your awareness of things grow, you will find that some of the principles that you believed and maybe took for granted need to change.
Yeah, and then if you can actually, not be overcome by fear in facing those things, because like you described, you're going against the grain, and it's risky. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
It's very risky to start questioning those things. And even, even if you're not thinking externally about what's going to happen to you in regards to other people and your church and your job, but even internally, and the struggle that is in facing, well, this is a part of me. If it certainly feels like it is, it feels like it's a part of your identity. And all of a sudden, things are just crumbling. You feel like you're falling apart. So it's almost like you don't want to start questioning, yet, like you said, if we're conscious beings, we're going to start to question things, or our natural tendency is to do that. And yet we resist it sometimes.
Yes.
So, I think if we could get over that fear, and this is part of why I'm doing this, is for people to have that safe place and understand that other people are, going through this journey too, and facing that fear, and that there's another side to it. It's not that you stay in that lonely place. It's not that you
No,
stay in that fear.
and there is a part of that fear. And it's funny how fear works in both directions. There's a part of that fear that comes not because you are worried that everything is going to fall apart, but that comes because you are struggling to accept what God has already put together. And here's the way it was for me. And I will spare you some of the details. I told you that I am a peace lover and I want to make peace. And part of the challenge of a peace lover is that while we make peace with the universe externally, there's usually a civil war going on internally. And for me, because I had convinced myself that the thoughts that I had about things and the feelings that I had about things were wrong, and that as I mature spiritually, I would
You'll get it.
I would get it, and I would stop having those thoughts, and I would stop having those feelings. It meant that the older I got, the more I studied the Bible, the more I prayed, the more I disciplined myself so that I don't have those thoughts and I don't have those feelings. And I failed repeatedly. A certain amount of self-loathing started to grow in me. And there's nothing as frustrating as confessing a sin today and being sure that you are submitted to God. And then tomorrow finding yourself committing the same sin. And then going back for confession, and then studying scripture, and then even sharing it as prayer requests for other people to pray for you. And then not being able to get rid of that particular nuisance in your life. You begin to, for me, I started to ask myself, what's wrong with me? Something must be wrong with me. Because I'm not supposed to think this way. And I'm not supposed to feel this way. And when God brings you to a place where he tells you that he loves you unconditionally, and that the way you are, the way you think, and the way you feel is the way he designed you to think and feel. And then you look around you and you say, God, if that's the way I should think and feel, why doesn't everybody think and feel the same way? Why can't I go out and tell everybody that this is the way I think and this is the way I feel, and everybody says, oh yes, Martin, we were just waiting you would tell us one of these days. When that is not happening, the fear of self-acceptance becomes high. You see, because you are learning to love yourself. You are learning to love not only the parts of yourself that you like, you are also learning to love the parts of yourself that you don't like. And that is when, for the first time, you begin to know unconditional love.
Wow.
Many of us think we love ourselves unconditionally, but we don't.
We definitely don't.
You
And
see,
that hinders us in our ability to love others.
exactly. Uh, Many of us think, I had a bad temper the other day. Gee, how can I love myself when I just blew my top the other day? Well, you might have blown your top the other day, and it might be that it was not the right time for you to blow your top. But that capacity to blow your top comes in handy in other situations where everybody is happy with the things as they are, and there is an injustice, and you are the only one who blows his top because there's an injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, you begin to realize that even what we call our dark side or our shadow, nature put it there for a purpose.
Wow.
And then you no longer apologize for whatever it is that one has been apologizing for. I mean, we all have our lists, right?
Yeah, certainly.
We all have, some of the things are physical. Maybe uh, maybe you have, maybe one has more weight than one really wants, and one is trying to lose weight and is not losing the weight.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get to a place where you accept yourself. You become comfortable with the fact that while you may still continue to try to lose weight, you are not going to despise yourself because you are not losing the weight that you want to lose. Whether it's trying to discipline yourself to eat correctly, and you realize that every time you think you're not going to have the sugar, you end up having some of the sugar. And you realize that you may have a lifelong struggle with sugar, but you no longer value yourself based on whether you are taking sugar or not taking sugar.
Mm.
I think this for me has been the path, uh, uh, the path of overcoming that fear, which is accepting me as who I am, validating my own self and saying, Martin, you are all right.
Wow. Goodness, that's beautiful.
So, and it always involves this dance of deconstruction and re-examining what is it that you believe and finding out. And it comes, of course, with having new experiences,
Mm-hmm.
you see. I'm sure you've been in this journey for a while, but you had not talked to me. Maybe after this, you'll find out that I have just totally corrupted you. And then you'll have to go back and purify yourself again.
Not at all. It's so interesting. I feel like before all of this started with me, I was kind of the epitome of what you were speaking of. I was very black and white in my thinking. It was this way or the highway. I was not open because I did have a lot of fear. I was worried about being led astray. I was worried about not pleasing God. I was worried about so many things. And so, now that I'm so open, because I feel like through this whole process, and what I said before is you come through it, even though like you said, there's micro deconstructions going on all the time in individuals and in yourself, but you come through this major thing and you eventually land somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
You get grounded again, and in yourself, in your understanding of God, in your understanding of the world around you and people around you, and you can start to have these conversations and hear all of these different perspectives that people have, people's experiences, their understandings and where they're coming from. And it no longer feels threatening. It no longer feels
Exactly.
dangerous. It just, it's enriching.
It
It,
is very enriching. In fact, when I was a young adult, I came across this idea that all truth is God's truth.
yes.
And I actually believed that. I actually believed that.
That's
But
beautiful.
I never lived it.
Mm.
And it is only now that I am actually living that. And if you see my post, and this is what sometimes makes people uncomfortable with me, I have already shared with you that my own spiritual journey started with me questioning the Bible. Why does the Bible have all of these contradictions?
Mhm.
And it ended up with me having a greater respect for the Bible.
Yeah.
But it has also allowed me to be open to truth from other sources. So I would readily quote a non-believer if what they say resonates with me.
Right.
I would readily quote a Buddhist or a Muslim if what they say resonates with me.
Absolutely.
I could never do that
Me neither.
earlier because I would first stop and think to myself, what's Kathryn going to think about this if she sees me quoting a Muslim?
Right.
And based on what I think Kathryn would think about me, then I won't quote a Muslim in Kathryn's presence.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's so true. And I think that is actually such a beautiful place to be because we head more towards the unity we want to see in humanity.
Yes.
And that fear, just kind of dies down.
And so now I find myself doing battle with pastors
Mm,
who don't understand unconditional love. So I go to a village in Africa because they know that I am a Christian and they're expecting that my work will be limited to Christians. And they feel uncomfortable when I start to say, let's go talk to the imam. Let's go to the mosque and find out what's going on with the imam. Let's find out when I start asking, do you have any Muslims here in this village? Do you have any non-believers?
right.
Then they begin to say, if that was what you were doing, why did you invite us pastors? I said, but because I want you to be the light.
Yeah.
Years ago, I would have been right there with this pastor saying, we are doing a Christian thing here. And the way to define that thing as Christian is to keep out the non-Christians.
Right.
And so I'm constantly having this, there are fights because even though they are not physical fights, there's real tension.
Yeah.
There's real tension.
Absolutely.
And because they are trying to label me some of them say, oh, we thought you were a Christian, but you are really just a universalist. Or you are a liberation theologist or a theologian, or you are this, you are. I said, I really don't know what all of those things are. And it will be impossible for one person to be all of those things. And if I'm really all of those things, then it's amazing.
I totally get that. I've been called certain labels that I don't even know what they mean.
Exactly.
And I get it. I understand human nature is to label in order to kind of help us to organize our environment and the people that we're around to try to, understand. But oh my goodness, it just gets to be crazy. And so you said earlier in our talk that you don't like to call yourself a Christian, but more so a lover of Christ. And is this one of the reasons why? Because,
Yes.
not a Christian anyway.
Yeah, exactly. because I found out, and I was telling my kids the other day, the label Christian comes with its own baggage.
It does.
Okay. You go to some places and you call yourself a Christian, and they immediately associate you with something you don't even know exists. And sometimes that thing is not even a positive thing. So that's one of the reasons I feel uncomfortable sometimes calling myself a Christian, because I know somebody's going to immediately conclude that I believe something that I don't even believe.
Right.
Okay. The second thing is that even within the church, the word Christian is always used exclusionary. And I don't like that. Let me give you an example. One of the things we're trying to do in Africa is to build a movement. Mm-hmm. Okay. I started calling that movement a movement of Christian humanitarian entrepreneurs. And the idea was that we were going to grow business people who start humanitarian projects and do both their business and their humanitarian work in such a way that the gospel is advanced. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened is that as I started to use this word Christian and I found out the baggage that it comes with, I changed to Christ-likeness. I said, okay, we'll call our movement a movement of Christ-like humanitarian entrepreneurs. Wow. Because that will connect us more to Christ more directly without the baggage that the word Christian brings. Mm-hmm. Well, that worked well for a while until I realized that even the word Christ-like in some people's minds was always bringing up Christian. So as of last year, we have started to describe ourselves as unconditionally loving humanitarian entrepreneurs.
Wow. Okay.
Now, unconditionally loving is a much longer word than we wanted. Christian or Christ-like was simpler. Mm-hmm. But we found that we had to take this other word that has this many syllables, because even the word Christ-like in most people's minds came with Christianity.
Right.
And the problem is not that it came with a positive Christianity, but that it evoked the exclusionary aspects of Christianity. And we want to be unconditionally loving. So we sat and we said, okay, let's just describe ourselves as that. Mm-hmm. And yes, we'll be unconditionally loving because we are Christians, because we love Christ. Mm-hmm. But that's the way we're going to describe ourselves. So that's how I have struggled with this label.
Wow.
it's so hard because no matter what you say, you still end up getting misunderstood.
That's
So,
true. I don't know if there's any way to really avoid that other than, just hoping that you have the opportunity to have conversation so that you could explain.
yeah, yeah, it has to, and that is why that's why the job is never done. You see, you have to keep doing the job over and over. So I tell people that even though I retired from teaching, I am still a teacher because I'm finding myself having to continually explain things. Sometimes having to explain things I have no idea about.
But you find a way.
because when you go into the community to do one thing or thinking you're going to do one thing, 12 other things arise.
I'm sure.
That if you don't take care of them, the one thing you came to take care of cannot be done.
Wow.
And so you very quickly become an expert of the 12 new things you just found out.
Right. Yeah. Hey, because you have to.
You have to.
Accomplished.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. That is just profound. Everything you said. And I want to respect your time. But the last question I have for you is, what would you say to anyone watching right now that's kind of in the middle of their journey and maybe experiencing that emotional roller coaster? Maybe they've been rejected by their church or other Christians. Maybe they're feeling lonely. Maybe they're feeling scared or anxious. What's your advice to them?
Well, I say hang in there. That sounds simplistic, but that's what happened for me. I just hung in there. Yes, the next thing would be find Kathryn and, and connect with her. You see, but the first thing I say is hang in there, because there is a phase of that journey that is lonely and is designed to be that way. You have to learn to deal with those things yourself. Wow. You see, you have to make peace with yourself without having somebody validate you.
My goodness.
You see, and that's the difficult part, because everything in your being says, this feels uncomfortable. I want somebody to understand what I am feeling. And yes, there will come a time where you will be able to find people who will understand what you're feeling. But don't cheat yourself out of that phase where you have that wrestling. You can call it wrestling with God or wrestling with yourself, or the dark night of the soul, whatever label you want to give to it, but it is essentially a lonely, or if not lonely, an alone process, an alone phase, where you look at yourself and you say, Martin, you have to accept that this particular thing is true about you. And do you love yourself?
Wow.
And after you've spent some time, and I am not expert enough to know how long that time is, my guess is that the length of that time differs with each person. For some person, it may be a 1 day thing. For another person, it may be a 1 year thing. But there's usually that period. Now, here's the fun part, is that as you begin to go out and you find people who are in your tribe, and you begin to fellowship with each other and encourage each other, you will still find that from time to time, you need to go back to that alone place. That's why it's important not to cheat yourself out of that aloneness at the beginning, because it's a place that you will come back to from time to time. And you got to get used to that. You got to make peace with the fact that there'll be times when nobody understands you. You see, there'll be times when the people, you are very tribe that you are very comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to make some growth, some progress, and they start to look at you and say, we knew Kathy, but this new Kathy is very different from the Kathryn that we knew. And then you find yourself alone again, you see. And so that's why my advice to them will be hang in there. And then after you've hung in there for some time, start to look for the people who are in your tribe. The good thing, and this is where the technology now comes in, and that with Facebook and with all of this social networking, it's much easier to find somebody in your tribe than it was decades ago. And sometimes it's not a physical person, sometimes it's just joining a group where people post things that are much more along the lines of what you are dealing with. If it's a theological issue, maybe you join a group that is posting on those things. If it's an issue with sexual identity, you join a group that is dealing with those things. If it's something to do with politics, you can always find a group that is posting on those things.
Right.
And I think I've touched on the big three right there: politics, theology, and sex.
Mm-hmm. Big three. Right. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think something that really struck me in the beginning when I was losing what felt like I was losing my tribe, perception of feeling, belonging in my tribe, to know that there was always another tribe. Like there's always another, even if it's like, a group of people that like green polka dots, you know what I mean? It exists somewhere, you will find them.
You will find them. It may take you a while, and that's why you have to learn to be comfortable with that alone time.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it will take you a while to find your tribe, but your tribe is out there.
Yeah. That's really excellent advice. And just thank you so much for sharing your story with me. It's so valuable, and I'm just so glad to have met you. And I know we'll obviously keep in touch on Facebook and otherwise. I'm very interested in what you're doing in Africa, and I don't know, we might be talking more about that.
Okay.
In the future.
I am always happy to share about what we are doing in Africa. And if you want to hear about that, we can set up another time at your convenience, and then we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested. I signed up for your newsletter, so I'm going to start. Good. Yeah. Good. I'm going to start getting updates. But thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for daring to talk to a stranger. I know that it may feel safer to talk to somebody from a distance, but it's not completely safe. So thank you for daring to reach out and have this conversation.
Well, thank you for accepting.
You might have thought that you were the one that needed this conversation, but I have to confess to you, I needed this conversation. I think I already said, I was as excited about this as if I was going on a date, right? All right, so there, I put it all on the table, Kathryn.
Yes, and I thank you. I mean, I love, I've just learned to be more transparent and vulnerable myself.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this is an exercise for me in expanding my comfort zone and meeting people that I don't know, and sharing parts of my story that are pretty vulnerable. And you know, it's a big deal. It's a really big deal. And we make this, by you and I having this discourse, we make it feel safe for other people to have similar conversations. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
You know? And I'm glad that it benefited you too. That means a lot to hear that.
Well, I totally enjoyed it.
Me too. And we'll talk again.
Thank you, Kathryn.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Niboh.
All right. And you can call me Martin. Martin is fine.
Okay, Martin. Okay.
And if you insist on calling me Dr. Niboh, then I would say add a few other words to it, like His Excellency, His Saintliness,
His Majesty.
His Majesty. Before you,
I like it.
Before you get to the Dr. Niboh part.
I will remember that.
All right.
From now on. All right. Take care, Martin. Have a good night.
Thank you. Yes. Bye-bye.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Mm-hmm.